And those also aren't radical notions in the sense that they underpin our conviction to international human rights norms. And what's kind of interesting is that if you look across some of our human rights norms, the ones that include what we now refer to as sort of more positive rights, we find it most easy to recognize those positive rights and to name them as important in things like the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think that's because we know ourselves to be in relationship with children. We know that we are interdependent and they depend on others. And so we're able to start from a relational point of view in generating those kinds of rights and in imagining what's necessary. But when it comes to our rights as adults, we stop thinking that way. We stop remembering that we're connected to one another and stop thinking about what we need from one another. And so in terms of my work in the world, this perspective, this approach, this understanding of the self and relational theory has influenced me to think about the implications of that for justice, and to look to the restorative justice movement that's developing and say, I think at its core that is a reform and an innovation and a paradigm shift that's trying to articulate and recognize this fact of our connection to one another and take that as the starting point for thinking about justice. And I think that's how we generate some of the things within restorative justice that are different from the way in which we do things in our traditional justice processes. It suddenly makes us aware that what matters about wrongdoing when one person harms another is that it not only harms them personally, it harms their connections with the person who hurt them, with their family and their immediate communities of support, with the broader community. It alienates and harms the offender from their communities of support in the broader community, and that weakens our social fabric as well. And so you can see the web of relationships between us affected by these acts of wrongdoing. And so then if we care about responding in a way that's going to make a difference and that's going to address the harms, we have to care about responding in a way that addresses the harms to these connections. And the only way you can really do that is to bring together those who are affected into processes and have inclusive processes that provide meaningful opportunities for participation, that can empower those involved to imagine different kinds of connections, and to know in a contextual way what it will take to produce respect, concern, and dignity on the ground in those relationships, right? So context really matters, and it matters that you have the input of those who are affected. And so that challenges our assumption in the context of criminal processes that it's the state and the offender that matter and the victim has very little voice, but also that the state we don't need a more robust notion of representing community and public views and interests in this than just professionalized state operators, that we need broader participation from those in community in figuring out what these kinds of connections might look like, and in putting in place a plan to move us from the kinds of harm to connections or the kinds of dysfunctional connections between people and in relationship that we've experienced that may have led to the particular wrongdoing or flowed from the wrongdoing to a different kind of future where we can try to operate differently connected to one another. So my work in the area of restorative justice is both in domestic legal systems where these ideas are being expressed largely in criminal justice contexts and significant programs with youth. And so I do some work in that area, and the province that I'm from in Canada, in Nova Scotia, has one of the more comprehensive and developed programs around youth justice, making restorative processes accessible through all of the entry points of the criminal justice system and for all of the young people across the province. And so that's been an exciting piece of work to be involved in because it's sort of moving beyond the initial stage of let's have a one-off pilot and developing into a robust program that helps us to see and address some of these larger questions about what's the relationship between the community's involvement in that and the role of the state, and how do we protect rights in those processes, and what kinds of involvement of community might we imagine, and how does it empower community, and those sort of broader questions that I think we're starting to be able to explore and ask and think about. And the other part of my work that that I've been involved in out of restorative justice and in connection with these broader ideas of relational theory has been in relation to truth commissions and to post-conflict societies that are emerging from periods of conflict or war, who've experienced historic and systemic human rights abuses, and sometimes some of the most serious human rights abuses. And in that context, some of my work has been imagining how we might take a restorative approach to responding to conflict and to moving into a post-conflict society that thinks more broadly about how they want to do justice and the kinds of social institutions they want to build. Some of the institutions in the immediate aftermath that are seeking to respond to these wrongdoings and seeking to respond to the abuses are truth commissions. And so some of the work I've done has been looking at the possibility of truth commissions to be institutions of restorative justice and to embody these sorts of values, and to think about how it is that we hold wrongdoers to account in a way that is meaningful, and in a way that's meaningful because they're actually being accountable to those they are connected with, and they're actually being accountable in an active way rather than passively being subjected to a punishment that's oriented or focused on making amends for the past or trying to right the past. That instead they're held accountable in ways that make them responsible for participating in the kind of future that they might be possible, and that places upon them obligations and responsibilities to be actively involved in the work of constructing that future and of building those different kinds of connections and relationships in society. And I think transitional contexts, post-conflict contexts actually have a window on this as what justice is really about, in a way that lots of sort of more stable and normalized democracies don't. Because they are acutely aware of the fact that the wrongs and the harms have had far-reaching implications beyond the immediate victim, to their families, to their support communities, to the broader community, and that the very fabric of society is damaged and injured when we harm one another in ways that breach our connections. And they know that the project of recovery, of imagining a new society, of thinking about the way in which they want to create a stable and peaceful society where they can sustain just and peaceful relationships over the long haul, has to start from the basic assumption that that work is about addressing the nature of the connection between folks. So one of the things we can access in these moments of transition, in these transitional contexts, is I think actually a window on justice and on what it requires that's relevant for those in more stable and normalized circumstances. And there really is much that we can learn then from attending to what does justice require in those times of transition, in those times of recovering from conflict, in those times of recovering from wrongs and from harms that have involved massive social upheaval. And I think one of the things we do that's so unfortunate is that we impose upon those contexts recovering our ideas of what justice requires, of what recovery requires, of what accountability requires, in terms of bringing our westernized institutions that are about prosecution and punishment and finding the individuals responsible, and that leave largely unaddressed these broader issues of the harm to the social fabric, but also the ways in which you want to respond to the specific issues that are contextualized and embedded in these broader social issues. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a really interesting, if we listen to it, dialogue and resistance from those who are on the ground in those contexts, who are saying those institutions won't serve us. And I think we need to think really carefully about the role then that institutions like the International Criminal Court or ad hoc tribunals can play, that's actually respectful and that contributes to the work of doing justice in those contexts, but that doesn't usurp the vision of justice that's emerging in those areas. And so there is an incredible need for support in terms of removing those who are continuing to commit violence, so for social protection and for incapacitation. We know actually that our criminal justice processes do those quite well. And those are important values. We do need to care about social protection. We do need to care about incapacitating those who will continue to cause harm to individuals and to relationships and connections. But that's a whole different thing than imagining that's the work of justice.